introduced the theme of reconciliation. The decree goes on to speak of that in three categories: reconciliation with God, reconciliation with one another, and reconciliation with creation. Just to spell those out a little bit, the decree affirms the threefold responsibility of society to proclaim the Word of God, to celebrate the sacraments, and to be involved in the ministry of charity or of service. And they recognize that the context for all of that now is a globalized world in which the dominant culture is characterized increasingly by this litany of horrors: subjectivism, relativism, hedonism, and materialism. That's the world we live in. And they observe that kind of culture results in interior emptiness on the one side, or a different reaction to it, a religious fundamentalism, as if you were trying to fill up that emptiness with certitudes that maybe get us in trouble. So it's no surprise that this decree would recommend the spiritual exercises as a corrective to all that and an answer to that sense of interior emptiness and of religious fundamentalism. So they encourage Jesuits to continue to make that a primary ministry to direct the exercises, and presumably the rest of us to participate in them ourselves. And they note that youth around the world are particularly vulnerable to that increasingly dominant culture characterized by all those problems. And so there's a call for a special ministry to youth. The second major category is reconciliation with one another. That picks up the justice theme, obviously. Repeatedly in this decree, you hear language about the marginalized, or speaking from the perspective of the poor. That's clearly how the society wants to think about globalization. They also recognize that when we have these transnational economic actors, that with enormous power, you've heard the statistics about how many corporations in the world have larger budgets than some nations. So it's much harder for nations to carry out the work they need to do on behalf of their own people, and be very vulnerable to this globalization. So there's a weakening of national sovereignty. They point out, as Maria Teresa has already suggested, has been mentioned previously, that the preferential option for the poor, which is kind of baseline, of course, for all of this, is implicit in Christological faith. That this is not an add-on, it doesn't come later. The very notion of Christ's incarnation is a kind of option for the poor that God, in God's own love, makes for humanity. And so this option for the poor that we're called to make is just in keeping with the deepest insights of Christian faith. They point out that the intellectual apostolate, which most of us here in this room are, of course, involved in, goes back to the very origins of the society, and that we have in such places now, universities and research centers, a special role to play in bridging cultures, rich and poor. A lot of our service programs are very oriented to doing that, and that we have some help in that these days with the new technologies. They can be part of the problem, they can also be part of the solution. And the phrases they use to kind of sum up their perspective comes from John Paul II. We should be seeking globalization in solidarity, or globalization without marginalization. And the fear is that it's just the opposite at this point. And the third category of reconciliation is with creation. And as I'm going to suggest a little later, this is one of the newer dimensions of this decree. They call for a more effective ecological solidarity. So solidarity now is not just something between humans, or between rich and poor, or among the poor, but humanity is called to be in solidarity with the creation that we all depend on. And Father Hams could do a whole session on this. I know he's written about it, but the decree points out that Ignatius, in both the principle and foundation of the exercises and the contemplation on the love of God at the end of the exercises, is essentially proposing a creation spirituality. So again, care for the creation is not some nice liberal idea that we tack on to Christian faith because it's trendy. It really comes out of the deepest insights of the Christian tradition, in the book of Genesis, for example. And they point out that, as we all know now, our future is threatened. The globe's chemistry and physics are threatened, and so this solidarity is extremely important to try to bring some corrective to that. And again, they point out that the universities and research centers associated with the society have a particular role to play in bridging some of those gaps that they see everywhere in the world, especially here. They would point out, for example, that the expertise of the society through the work of Jesuit refugee services gives the society particular claim on that issue and can see up close and personal what that life is like and what that's like in terms of the environmental problems that many of these same countries face. And that needs to become part of the research and advocacy that goes on in Jesuit universities and research centers.